In this lesson, you will understand the purpose of the Constitution, how the Constitution is organized, and how we got the Constitution that we have today. The purpose of the Constitution is to provide a basic set of rules for the way that our government is run, from the highest level to the lowest level. It determines the powers that each part of government has, and importantly, sets limitations on each power so that government doesn't get out of control. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land. The Constitution is divided into a preamble or introduction, which sets the philosophy and tone for the entire document. And then it has 7 articles or sections. In Article 1, the powers and roles of Congress are laid out. In Article 2, the president's roles and responsibilities are laid out. And finally, in Article 3, we learn all about the roles and responsibilities and powers of the judicial system or courts. The plan of government that the Constitution created was actually not the first plan, and it was actually a big change from the original plan. So we are going to go back in time to get the full story. Why was it written and when was it written? The Constitution was written just a few years after the new nation won its independence from the British in the American Revolution. This image shows a depiction of that final surrender. The Constitution is actually a replacement for the first plan of American government. That original plan was called the Articles of Confederation, and it was actually written during the Revolutionary War against the British in 1781, 2 years before it was over. But it quickly became clear that the plan the Articles of Confederation laid out had some serious flaws. So, so what was the biggest problem with the Articles of Confederation? As you can see from that teachers' stellar performance. Some of the problems were that the states had most of the important powers, and that would include some of the things that teacher sang about, like regulating commerce and trade. States were able to kind of make their own decisions about that. The federal government was able to declare war, but they could not get states to join the military. Um, they could print their own money. The federal government could print its own money, but then states were printing their own money too. So they couldn't get other states to take that money because it wasn't valuable to them. So that was kind of a big old mess. And all of this became a problem when they wanted to do trade overseas, and exchange rates were a big old mess, as well as have combined state troops for purposes of national interest. And he mentioned Shays' Rebellion, which I'm sure you guys remembered learning about last year. So there was no way to really enforce things on a state level, and the Articles of Confederation were just weak. So the question is, did they want to risk having a strong government? And isn't that what they had just escaped with the British? So they got together to discuss a new plan in Philadelphia in 1787, and a group of representatives from almost every state showed up to discuss fixing it. And after deliberation, they decided to just create a completely new plan. They asked, how can we create a government that is strong enough to do all of the things that we need it to do, but keep it from someday turning against us, like the British did? What they came up with was an idea called federalism, which means shared power. The national government, or the federal government, then would have specific powers that it logically should have. For example, foreign policy, or anything that regards interaction with other countries, the military, anything that has to do with printing money or the money system, anything that regards or involves crossing state lines. All of those things logically make sense that some kind of strong centralized government needs to have control over those things. States then would then get to make up their own laws about anything that affects them and the variations that would be dependent on population and culture, like schools, health, safety, crimes, marriage, anything that would be varying. And all of that just makes logical sense. The question is, what do we do to make sure that the federal government doesn't get too much power? Because we've been traumatized and we went through that. So what else can we do with this new plan to prevent tyranny? So the delegates made sure that they created some systems, and that included separation of powers into branches, as well as checks and balances. And you can see that checks and balances means that each branch can take an action to block anything that they think is an unwise or an illegal, unconstitutional action that another branch is doing. So the arrows in the graphic that you see represent some of those actions that the Constitution specifically says they can do to check or take action against another branch to balance out their power. For example, the executive branch can actually veto or stop legislation that the legislative branch makes if the executive branch thinks that it's unwise or a bad action. The legislative branch can actually impeach a president if they believe the president is doing something that is illegal. They can approve any nomination that the executive branch makes. The legislative branch can actually impeach judges. The judicial branch can declare any law unconstitutional. So you can see all of these arrows represent the different ways that those branches can check each other to make sure that no one single group has too much power. The rest of the Constitution is the rest of the plan of the government. That is the supreme law of the country. Article 4 specifically talks about how to bring in new states because the delegates knew that the country was growing and that those 13 colonies that had become states were not going to be the only territory that the United States would be forever. Article 5 talks about how, if there are going to be any changes to the Constitution, how we would make that, how that process would go about. And you can see in some of these pictures some specific references to our history of having amendments. Article 6 is very clear about the supremacy clause, that the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and that no law can be made that is in contradiction to the Constitution. Article 7 talks about how the Constitution will be ratified, which was a tricky process because initially only 5 states wanted to ratify the Constitution. And it took a while because there were delegates who were specifically Federalist and believed in federalism. And then there were delegates who believed in anti federalism and wanted the states to have more powers. Eventually, the Bill of Rights was created. And the Bill of Rights essentially outlined individual rights so that people would have an outline of what freedoms the government could not step over. It was a compromise that involved 10 amendments, and it ended up ensuring that all 13 states were able to ratify the Constitution. You may have heard or be fond of some of these rights that are protected in the Bill of Rights, such as freedom of religion, speech, the freedom of the press, the freedom to peacefully assemble, the right to a fair public trial, the right to bear arms, and the right to own property. And today, the Constitution is still considered the supreme law of the land. Thank you for paying attention to this lesson.